Hey folks, Dr. Lava here. Last time we talked about the 6 most interesting bits of cut content from the final version of Ocarina of Time, with number 1 being Ura Zelda itself. It's probably Nintendo's most legendary unreleased game. But what exactly was Ura Zelda, and why was it never released? First, a little background. In the mid-1990s, Shigeru Miyamoto began development of the first 3D Zelda game. This early version of the game looked very different to the final product, and in fact went through several very distinct iterations during its development process. These early builds of the game are often referred to collectively as Zelda 64, and included cut content like what you saw in last week's video, as well as Young Epona, and the mysterious Ocarina pedestal and Unicorn Fountain. Ocarina was originally planned for the Nintendo 64 add-on called the 64DD, so some of its concepts like a persistent world had to be scrapped when the 64DD's delayed release and eventual failure meant Ocarina of Time would have to be downgraded to fit onto a standard N64 cartridge. But after the downgrade, Miyamoto planned to eventually release a 64DD expansion to Ocarina that would add at least some of those features back in and add new content as well. This future disk drive expansion would come to be known as Ura Zelda. Ura means flip side, like the flip side of a coin, and this is what Ura Zelda was, not an entirely new game, but Ocarina's flip side. The expansion was essentially a patch, what today would be released as DLC. It would offer more difficult and redesigned temples, shuffled around item locations, more characters, and all kinds of new content like mini-games, items, masks, and side quests. The people of Hyrule wouldn't be static anymore. They were going to have daily schedules that they followed, like the townsfolk in Majora's Mask. Gamers could even create their own masks in the 64DD's talent studio, or take a picture of a friend's face with a Game Boy camera, then import it into Ura Zelda and wear it around Hyrule. It's sometimes said that a new item would be included that allows you to finally beat Hyrule's famous Running Man in a race, as well as a way to unfreeze Zora's domain. It's certainly possible that was planned at some point, but now I've come to believe that those 2 particular sequences were most likely just wishful thinking on the part of some of the game's fans. Sometimes it can be difficult to parse out what Nintendo was actually planning and what was the fans' imaginations running wild. For example, when Miyamoto said that there would be new temples in the game, did he mean entirely new temples like the Light, Sky, and Wind dungeons? Or when he said new temples, was he simply referring to the old ones being redesigned? In some cases, it can be hard to distinguish fact from fiction. But at the end of the day, this is what Ura Zelda was going to be. Ocarina of Time 2.0. New features and new stuff, in the same old Hyrule. So after Ocarina of Time's release in November 98, Miyamoto tasked Eiji Aonuma, one of Ocarina's co-directors, with spearheading the Ura Zelda project. Miyamoto's hope for Ura Zelda was that it could spur sales of the 64DD, and also that it would allow for a new Zelda game to be developed in just a single year, much quicker than Ocarina's 4-year development process. But Aonuma wasn't thrilled at the prospect of designing a flip side to Hyrule, later explaining, "I didn't think we'd be able to call the finished result a new Zelda game. However, I just couldn't say no to making it. So to that end, I made a bargain with Miyamoto. If I could make a new Zelda game within a year, we wouldn't have to make Ura Zelda." And so the deal was struck, and the lion's share of the Ura Zelda team, about 50 developers, moved on to a new project that they called Zelda Gaiden, meaning side story, which was eventually released as Majora's Mask. Nobody knew it at the time, but by accepting Aonuma's request, Ura Zelda's fate was sealed. In fact, if there's just one man that you could point the finger at for the death of Ura Zelda, it's Eiji Aonuma. But the game was still going to be made, with a small team remaining to continue working on it. In a September 99 interview with Japanese magazine 64 Dream, Miyamoto told the interviewer, "Whether we release Ura Zelda or not, we're still working on it." But now that his budget and staff had been slashed in time, so was its scope and ambition. In the year following Ocarina's release, the very idea of what Ura Zelda was going to be became less and less. The nail in the coffin may have been the utter failure of the 64DD, which only managed to sell 15,000 units. So all those old disk drive concepts meant to be carried over from Zelda 64 to Ura had to be thrown out. Less than a year after that interview, in August 2000, Miyamoto announced at a Tokyo press conference that Ura Zelda had been completed for some time. But Nintendo couldn't quite figure out how to release the game, and it wasn't until a couple years later, in November 2002, Nintendo offered up an Ocarina of Time Master Quest bonus disc for gamers who pre-ordered a copy of Wind Waker on GameCube. Nintendo told gamers that Master Quest is Ura Zelda, and Wind Waker became the most pre-ordered game in history, at least for the time, with over 500,000 Zelda fans placing their orders and snapping up their copies of Master Quest. The game was well received, but some fans felt shortchanged. This was nothing but the same old Ocarina, but with remixed dungeons. Where was the rest of Ura Zelda? Many were convinced that Nintendo was holding out on them, keeping Ura Zelda hidden away deep inside its vaults for some nefarious reason. Some Zelda conspiracy theorists are still convinced of this. But the unfortunate truth is that when Nintendo's resources were shifted to Majora's Mask, all the grand aspirations of the late 90s, like the ambitious concepts only possible with the disk drive, the new characters and side quests, even the reshuffled item locations. Over time, all of them were eventually discarded, leaving nothing to be developed but the redesigned dungeons. So in a way, Master Quest really was Ura Zelda. It's what Ura Zelda had become, a shadow of its former self, and of what fans had imagined when they dreamt of exploring Hyrule 2.0. Various groups of hackers have joined forces over the years to try to recreate what they envisioned Ura Zelda could have been, sparking the imaginations of fans and Zelda conspiracy theorists alike, with Ocarina mods like Project Beta Triforce or Z64's Ocarina of Time Ura project. However, at the time of this video's publication, all those mods claiming to be Ura Zelda's spiritual successor, what the hackers themselves sometimes call restoration projects, have never been completed or were abandoned long ago. But a few of them can be played with emulators, and that's where some of the gameplay for this video came from. Because despite any rumors you might see on the internet, there is no Ura Zelda gameplay footage, or lead cutscenes, or recently discovered beta disc pride from some Nintendo vault. Because the game as we like to think of it, Miyamoto's dream game, with fans' own ideas sprinkled on top, was never developed. The only thing left of Ura Zelda is Master Quest, and sadly, everything else was just great ideas that never actually got made. I know that last week I said that Ura Zelda would have a way to outrun the Running Man, and that the game was almost complete, and by the game I meant the legend of the game. Well, I didn't realize it, but I drank some of the Ura Zelda Kool-Aid myself. After doing the research this week, I realized I didn't know the story of the game nearly as well as I thought I did. I was this guy.
Just simpering control freaks in big nerd packs, taking everything over, ruling everything.
When I should have been this guy.
It happens.
What, shit?
Sometimes.
Maybe it would have been more fun if I'd come in this week and kept the legend alive with talk of vaults and that guy who supposedly got a copy of the game then died mysteriously back in 2009. But all that's a bunch of bullshit and misinformation, and the account that I brought to you here today is the truth about Ura Zelda, sad as it is. So I apologize for getting it wrong at the end of last week's video. Okay, well, next week won't be such a downer, so subscribe if you don't want to miss out on more stories about Nintendo's cut content. If there are any corrections that need to be made, I'll put them in this video's description, along with all my sources. Okay, thanks for watching. See you next time. Release in a 2009 interview with German-language magazine Endzone, the game's director, Eiji Aonuma, shed some light on the cut dungeon question, stating that originally there had been 3 child temples and 6 adult temples, but ultimately one of the adult temples had to be cut, leaving a total of 8 dungeons. Most likely, it was the Wind Temple that was cut from the final product, because the Ice Cavern went on to become one of the game's mini dungeons. Concepts, and in the words of the document, cranked the game's morphball areas up to 11. The ship at some point was going to be sucked into an alternate dimension. which would have allowed for some areas of the ship to have reverse gravity, so you'd be standing on the ceiling, and time itself would run backwards in other areas, so that creatures and machines would move in reverse, water would flow upwards into the faucets, and these disruptions would be the basis for some of the game's puzzles.